Hello, everyone, and welcome to OPSWAT's webinar about proven deployments in banking and financial services. I'm Adam Rocker. I'm on the product management team at OPSWAT, and with me here.
I'm Garrett Beckler, Senior Solutions Architect here at OPSWAT, covering the financial services vertical across North America.
All right, thanks, Garrett. Just a short introduction of OPSWAT, what we do, how long we've been doing it for. Really, we've been around for over 20 years now, and our mission at OPSWAT has been to protect critical infrastructure. We specialize in securing both OT and IT environments, and today we're going to focus specifically on the banking and financial services sector. So we do focus on critical infrastructure, and that includes really anything that if it was gone tomorrow would make a huge negative impact on our day-to-day lives. So for the agenda today, we're going to talk about how data and files move throughout organizations and financial services, some of the common challenges, the myths versus the reality of securing those data workflows, and then talk about OPSWAT's multi-layered file protection solution. And we're also going to get into some proven deployments where customers have used these solutions to ensure that data in motion stays in motion, and they have good productivity. So we'll start out here. There's a lot of numbers on this screen, and we could pull numbers from a lot of different sources. The truth is, and Garrett, I know you can speak to this. The truth is there's a lot of threats out there, a lot of security threats, and they're successful.
Right? And not only are they successful, but they're impactful to business and reputation, which have a larger hit on the bottom line, overall bottom line from a business productivity standpoint and from a customer reputation standpoint. The bigger piece of this, however, is that while things are reported, not everything is reported. So there's a lot of attacks here that actually aren't captured that are very impactful, but not just impactful to the actual bank, but the actual end user and their ability to actually perform their job and their job satisfaction, which is critical to actually having success throughout your organization.
Right. So and there's a lot of regulations that go along with this, to keep people compliant, keep people secure. So there's a lot of work that goes into actually protecting these critical infrastructure companies. So let's talk about some of the common challenges that are faced by customers in financial services. Garrett?
Yeah, as crazy as it is, right? This is the same topic list we've actually been speaking about for the last 20 years. They've just gotten more complex. AI has actually accelerated the ability of malicious actors to actually facilitate those attacks across those given environments and across a multitude of attack vectors. Whether we talk about that third-party supply chain attack, attacking an aquarium in a casino, or attacking a thermostat in a store, that threat landscape and that nature of connected devices across your enterprise, and not to mention shadow IT, right? People bringing in devices, personal devices,
Right.
hospitals where the child of a patient maybe brings in a PlayStation and connects it to your hospital network. It's just prime examples of some of those vectors that actually weren't seen 20 years ago that are now additional vector things that you actually have to worry about across the scope of your environments. But it's also the social engineering with AI has gotten much easier to
Yeah,
actually,
absolutely.
soak in somebody's social media profiles, whether it be LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok videos you post, all of that data now available to everyone and anyone to build a customized attack to try and compromise your device. And not every attack requires you to click on something, right? Hovering
Right.
over an image can compromise the device, whether it be a mobile device and root your mobile device, and therefore make you susceptible to uh, third-party MFA attacks, right? Where somebody can capture your multi-factor authentication token as it goes to your phone, to just installing a backdoor malware or a malicious
Right.
extension inside your browser. So a very complex set of challenges. And most folks have actually deployed defense in depth and have multiple layers of protection and multiple layers of observation across their enterprise. But not everything resides inside the enterprise, and it makes it very difficult to protect your infrastructure as a result.
Yeah. A lot of, as technology has given us a whole lot of cool stuff that makes our life easier, makes our job easier. It's increased the surface area of attack, and it's not just the large companies that are being attacked. It really is people that are unwitting pawns within a larger security type of problem. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and absolutely. And your infrastructure is no longer necessarily your infrastructure, right? Between co-located data centers to,
right.
shared cloud services.
Multi-cloud,
So yeah, you're distributed all over the place, and not every cloud is equal. And from a security standpoint, from an accessibility standpoint, and a technology standpoint. So there's a lot of confusion in some cases when a company says we're going to do this inside of a Google Cloud platform, and we're going to do this inside of an AWS. And while they have the similar technologies, the naming is all different, right? And the
right,
policy setting and the methodologies for setting security policy is very different, and it makes for a lot of additional complexity. And shadow IT is very prevalent there because it's very easy for someone to set up an additional account, connect it to another resource set, and
right.
proliferate the risk of files entering an environment or data moving within the scope of an environment that may not have the same layer of scrutiny that your hardened systems may.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we just saw the story about Clorox and how someone called into the help desk and was
Yeah,
able to move laterally and then escalate the privileges for 300 and some odd $1 million worth of damage.
yeah, taking care of
Crazy.
the one element that's almost impossible to 100% protect against the human element,
The
right?
human element, absolutely. And so there's myths that we talk about, uh, you know, with customers having defense in depth. There's still a there's still a gap there. I think whether folks think that they have all the security they need, or they're running into something where they're not seeing the blind spots that they have. So no, myth number one. And Garrett, let me know how much this rings true in your experience. You have the best single AV solution, right? I can tell you a couple that'll claim 100% protection. You throw some EDR on there, and now you're 100% covered. What?
Yeah, and just like anything else, right? So, in my experience doing incident response, there's always what we call the cubicle jumping moment, right? Which is typically that exception that was set up for something
Right,
that creates a human based gap in that protection that is then exploited either intentionally or accidentally throughout process. And sometimes our review processes through those exceptions don't always match. So there's still the human element to that configuration, that human element to making sure that things are all up to date. And then there are challenges there, but the broader challenge is you're relying on a singular vendor in most cases to do everything.
right,
And we know, this is a global environment now. It's no longer, hey, I'm only worried about things coming from a specific region or a set of regions. It's how are you aware of everything? If you only operate in North America, how are you aware of what's happening in South Korea? How are you aware of what's actually happening in Europe or South America? And so having that singles, like, yes, they look at behaviors and they're
mhm,
extraordinary at detecting most
sure,
behavior types. But what happens when it doesn't detect those things? And
right,
what's the actual impact to not just the end user, but the number of folks that actually have to engage to actually try and understand what's taking place within the scope of that compromise, if it's a compromise at all, right? A lot of cases you'll spend your time chasing your own tail
right.
for a lot of
You're
different types.
always playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
You're always in reactive mode to try to go fix a problem. And so like number two, why can't those technologies protect us from all of the other stuff, right? It's got the DDoS protection, it's got you know all the different network layers that we're protecting attacks from. But what is the gap there,
Yeah.
right? When you've got that WAF or that load balancer.
Well, I sum it up to really two things. We discussed one of them earlier, right? Which is proliferation of multitude of services, hosting services, where you're actually um, paying for services and service types, whether it be storage, application, execution, right? Whatever it may be. So those services like a WAF or an IPS or a firewall or a proxy don't necessarily intercept all of that traffic or interact
They're
with
not
all that
designed to.
traffic. Right?
That's the
No,
thing.
it's trust, right? It's absolute trust. Hey, I'm trusting that it's coming from this source and
Right,
it's coming through, but we're not always putting those solutions in front of many of those sources, whether it be for latency, whether it be for just not the effective controls in place. So maybe they don't have an API that allows you to inspect all of that traffic as it comes through that platform,
right,
right? And those companies are also evolving as we go, and they're picking up more and more of those things, but we don't always have those things in place. And in many cases, we're exploring those things while the business is moving at a different pace, right?
right,
Their job is to get those things up and running, and our security's job, as much as we like to say we're in front of it, we don't always get the opportunity to actually be proactive. In a lot of cases, we're reactive and trying
right.
to figure out what the best solution is. And sometimes it's just the solution that's on hand, yeah, based on the budgetary cycles and where money
Right.
is available or not available, and resources are available or not available. Resources, probably the number one challenge in IT today, especially in cybersecurity. Resources. We don't train enough of them, and we simply don't have enough of them in the marketplace. And the job that they have to do is extraordinarily complex.
And I think that brings us to three, where when you don't necessarily have the budget, is it safe to assume that your partner, right, the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis, have they done the security steps to ensure that, the two businesses can talk to each other without having some malware get in between?
Yeah,
Mm.
and God knows we've both been through enough of those audits, right?
Right,
So, as a vendor that provides a SaaS platform as well as software, right? We're actually going through a multitude of audits, right? For
right,
both cloud services and for our on-premise software. You have limits of liability, and you have all of those terms that you put into your contract to say that, hey, you're going to share in this responsibility, either from a financial mechanism and or a support mechanism, and usually a combination therein.
sure.
And everyone has their ideal set of terms.
Yeah,
However, that's just a set of terms. It's not the actual controls that sit on the back end. And again, it's that human element. What happens when someone uses a less complex password or temporarily disables MFA to troubleshoot something, and that account becomes compromised because the shields are down for a temporary period of time. You can't control everything, and deployments for 0-day patches take time, right?
yeah,
So when you talk about IoT devices, they're now part of your core infrastructure, thermostats, door controls, all of those things. Those are generally third party run in most cases, right? You're contracting with a third party to help provide support for those devices. Now, how long does it take them to do those upgrades and those updates? What if they have to put somebody on site? And we see this in our business all the time. Well, it doesn't necessarily apply to financial services when you talk about nuclear facilities or
right,
water and gas, electric and gas, where somebody's in there with the USB key to try, and it has to be a manual effort because there is no automation there.
right.
So all of those things generate additional risk, and while we do get to them, it's microseconds difference between whether or not you're protected and not protected, and those
That's a
bad
great point. Yeah.
those bad actors are looking for those things that are not protected. And if they have any footprint on the internet whatsoever, they generally tend to find them pretty quickly.
So let's talk about footprint, because I know this is something that
Yeah.
we've looked at a lot. It really helps illustrate a lot of the issues. I'm going to steal something from our great partner F5. This kind of represents the ball of fire, right?
Yeah.
This is the central place where you've got a bunch of files coming in from external. You've got your DMZs, which are somewhat protected, and then you've got your protected internet, your enterprise network on the inside. But you've got all of these other connections just to make just to be able to do your day-to-day business. I mean, it's a huge task to try to identify where all the different blind spots are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a resource intensive set of activities. You have business units that have critical business need that are always trying to stay one step ahead of their competitors and always looking for the latest and greatest technology and or uh, skill set from an engineer standpoint, to actually put something in place that's going to be that one notch ahead of their
Right.
competitors, right? So, hey, this person knows this technology and this is going to be the next greatest thing. Well, maybe there isn't a security tool that actually protects you against that next greatest technology, and you're trying to ad hoc it, but across multitude of environments, and some of this with big fines attached if there is a compromise, right?
Yeah,
And critical business needs that get shut off. Well, what's the impact of your Swift system going down within the scope of your financial services org?
right.
It,
Well, it speaks to, the idea of like data in motion is how these organizations stay in business,
yeah,
right? Getting that file, getting that data from point A to point B to point C, that's how they stay in business. That's how they get the intel that they need to, do better at business. But there's still that large attack area because of all the different external connections.
yeah, and we throw around zero trust a lot, right? In the security industry, a ton, and it's not a new concept. It's actually been around for a long time, but the execution of it has been fairly recent, right? Across
Right.
the multitudes of various verticals. But from a file perspective, files have inherent trust, right? It's the belief that what you're sending me is actually something based on a human interaction in most cases
Hmm.
is safe or secure, right? So if I'm a customer and I'm actually applying for a loan, you're going to want to see my pay statements. You're going to want to see maybe my tax statements. Maybe you want a picture of the asset, right? That we're
Right.
actually going to procure, especially in the case of a refinance, right? If maybe it's damage or something of that nature. And so you're collecting all of that data. And because there's a human connection on the other end, you're actually establishing a preliminary trust, right?
Yeah.
To actually that the content I'm going to send you is going to be done in good faith and it's going to be safe for viewing. It's safe on my end. So why wouldn't it be safe on your end?
Right.
Uh, and it's a lot of different file formats and it's a lot of different embedded content in many cases. And that's just one example. Portfolio management, wealth management. Your business is actually looking for intelligence-based data from you and with you.
Right.
So there's all of those things that are constantly in motion. We're always worried about PII, right? Personal
Mhm.
identifiable information, an account number that goes stray
Right.
and gets exposed in some way, shape, or form, or in a QA database with a rudimentary password. Uh, but at the same time, it's across a multitude of systems, a multitude of platforms, a multitude of infrastructure components. And it is literally spaghetti to try and figure out how that's actually going to look. It's all intertwined. You
Yeah.
have a common set of tools. And then you need to try and figure out what's actually happening within the scope of that. But the business needs it now.
Right.
They need the integrity of that data to be there every single time. And they need to make sure that the customer satisfaction remains high because if they don't respond in a timely manner, they lose that business to another aggressive financial services firm.
Right.
Um,
That
and
can deliver
yeah, the
in the
proliferation
time.
of the internet is that you can shop for car insurance across 25 different vendors from a single site.
Right.
Same thing for loans. Same thing for who your next broker is going to be. You can look at those track records, and AI makes it even easier than that now that we have these large learning models that actually look at composite results over the course of time. So, any one of those things that enters into your environment adds a degree of risk to your business. And so, there's that compromise between security and efficiency. As a security practitioner, I like to say no a lot, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, saying no all the time means that you can't do business
Right.
as you need to.
So the one thing that sticks out to me about this is that, this data flow applies whether you are a smaller bank
Yeah.
or a larger bank, right? You still have to make all these connections with either your customers, other banks within the industry. So it's not just limited to, large marquee names that everyone has heard of globally. So
Yeah, and in many cases, you don't have the. And we've been talking about staffing being one of the most critical challenges inside of cybersecurity. So in many cases, you're actually subscribing to a third party to provide many of these services for you, whether it be a hosted based service or borrowing a service, paying for a service from a larger entity. So you may not have 100% control over all of those activities in this infrastructure, but generically speaking, you're going to have all of these components within the scope of your financial services infrastructure. So it creates a very very difficult challenge for any security practitioner to try and understand and adequately cover across an enterprise, let alone report on. right? This is
Yeah.
I see here typically against all those different platforms a multitude and an extreme multitude of consoles that I'm going to have to try and manage and try and
Right.
automate so that I can actually
And
react and
report against.
respond in a timely manner.
Yeah. It's a it's a challenge. And what we're going to do is kind of switch over to, taking some customers that we've
Oh,
worked with that have had some of these issues, right? Or still have issues that we're working through with them to close those security gaps. And we're going to jump into them. So first one, a good quote right there. But we'll kind of flip through these. Large bank LLB. We do have this the full story published on our website, and essentially it's close to what you were talking about there, Garrett. They needed to open a new channel, uh, basically a customer portal, and what they had prior to that was quite manual and didn't really have any security tied to it. Um, this is a very common, I think, um, use case, where banks need to, whether it's know your customer laws or all of the other anti-money laundering laws that need to be in place so that customers can identify themselves properly to the bank. And you may have somebody that is well-meaning, right? You've got that inherent trust that I'm going to give you a file and it's going to have my bank statement. It's going to have, all of these different things on it. But that person may not know. They may be unwittingly, you know, part of a botnet, or part of some sort of remote access scheme where they are infected, right? And they are sending in data to the bank that's not clean.
yeah, absolutely. And this is a global challenge, not just financial services, but financial services generally tends to deal with the lion's share of content coming from customers.
Mhm.
When you talk about everything you do, when you apply for credit, right, requires that some form of identification and/or content gets sent for evaluation, whether it be a loan, whether it be setting up your first retail banking account, right? You're
Right.
sending in a picture of your driver's license if you're not going into a branch. I mean, God forbid anybody goes into an actual branch to
Right.
do real banking. Right? But I know those folks, they're phenomenal. I love going into the branch, but there's so many things that I can do, online that, you
Right.
get lazy and you sit behind that quote unquote firewall of safety, right? Of my front door
Mhm.
for allows me to do all that work without having to go out into the wild outdoors. But this is a common challenge in financial services, and it's one that they've addressed in a myriad of ways over the course of time.
Right.
In most cases, with the solution that's most effective for the business unit that's actually ingesting the content. So, in a lot of cases, when you talk to these organizations, they may use three, four, five different tools to accomplish this singular task, whether it be a built-in tool from AWS with guard duty and watch
Right.
in the scope of their platform that does a good job of detecting malicious content. Now, hey, it's there. It's included as part of the platform. I can just enable it, and that's what we're going to rely on. Well, that's different than the ICAP based security solution that I've had in place in my organization for the last 10 years. It's actually done a
Right.
great job of protecting my assets. So, many cases, it's disparate. Again, multiple consoles, multiple contextual components that you need to try and understand to actively investigate any alert or event, especially when it's on a critical system. What happens if it gets to a trading floor system? Take that system
Yeah.
offline, put another system in place. What's that downtime cost? Not to mention the cost of an analyst that has to now go do full forensics on that system to try and determine how that file got there, how it was executed, and then what the overall impact to that specific workstation, and then collect a report because it's a
Right.
trading floor device. There may be some federal reporting that you have to do on that specific event or incident. So it's a huge time suck, and it's a loss of trust, right,
Yeah.
from your employees that I'm not really necessarily protected. What's going to happen, and how much downtime am I going to lose next time this happens, right?
Right.
And it may never happen, but that mindset's absolutely still there. But a common problem across most financial services organizations, and having a common infrastructure where we can actually intercept all those things, regardless of the platform in which that file is moving from outside in, inside out, or within the confines of an organization, regardless of, again, regardless of where the file sits, right?
Right.
So if it's in an S3 bucket, if it's in a SharePoint folder, if it's in Box or Dropbox or Google Drive, it's coming in through a firewall, or you mentioned F5, right? They have a very robust infrastructure that actually caches your data as it comes across your environment. Using the same platform to physically do all of that scanning and doing it in a way that's layered, creates an approach that allows you to not only have a single frame of reference, but an
Mhm.
extraordinarily effective way of managing that data as it moves throughout whatever mechanism or application is necessary to conduct that business. And again, it's a layered based approach to do so.
Right.
So it's not just scanning from an antivirus perspective. And we'll get into some of those concepts and technologies, but it's a layered approach of being able to say, hey, we're able to scan this with multiple antivirus engines simultaneously. So you're not relying on that vendor at the WAF, that vendor at
Right.
the endpoint, right? The vendor at the proxy. So there's three, right? Maybe it's
Right.
going to a cloud bucket. Maybe there's four. But what if you can do it with 35?
Right.
How
Yeah.
and where it's so it creates a better sense of security, but a more effective method of actually detecting malicious content, especially when you're using engines from across the planet, whether it be an engine from Romania, South Korea, North America. Uh, you're using a combination of all the above to actually do those detections anytime the file moves in transit. And then we have multiple layers on top of that that most of our customers, especially in the financial services, take advantage of as part of that scan based on file type, workflow, or business need. And
Yeah.
we'll definitely
And
speak about that in our next use case.
yeah, and LLB did that here. They've got like you're describing, multiple data flows that are coming from here, that are coming from there, and some of them are protected by, let's say, an F5 stack, that has an ICAP interface, and they can send all that data over to us. On the other side, with the other data coming in, it's a custom application from a partner bank, and so they've got to use the API to do
Sure.
that integration. So it's not just one solution, right? You have to have a solution that does fit, that gives you that cohesive outcome at the end.
Yeah, and it's optimized for the type of traffic it's actually receiving,
Right.
right? So that you're building workflows based off of the type of traffic received from each individual entity. So if I don't want to allow a specific file type, if I want to inherently trust a specific file type, we absolutely can do that. And that's critical to a bank meeting their SLAs from a latency perspective or a business velocity perspective.
Right. All right. Well, so this right here, I wanted to include as well. And we've talked about this slide a little bit, Garrett.
Yeah.
But I'll throw it to you. Just wanted to say one quick thing is that as data is moving through, we talk about data in motion, and data in motion, maintaining that is one of the big keys. So Garrett, I know you got some thoughts here. I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the craziest topics we get into with a number of our financial services customers because they worry about file integrity. So what we're talking about here is content disarm and reconstruct, CDR, right? And
Right.
so this is the ability to actually take a file down to its barest components, understand what the risk is in each one of those components, and then remove those components and provide a sanitized copy of that file, whether it be re-rendering an image to make sure there's no steganography or an embedded script, to ripping a script out of a PDF that maybe
Right.
doesn't need to be there for an analyst to actually do their job, or a loan officer to do their job. So the conversation is always gets to, but the file integrity as there's data integrity rules that we actually have to meet.
Right.
Um, and so
Data
one of the
custody,
things, yeah,
non-repudiation, all the different, yeah.
absolutely. And so one of the things that we do from a workflow perspective for those customers is we provide the sanitized content to the folks that actually need to see it right away. So we'll pull those links out. Now we'll disable those macros in that Excel file.
Mhm.
We'll re-render those images. We'll do all of those things in that data stream. And at the same time, we can repository the originals to
Right.
someplace that where they're stored for the amount of time that that data needs to actually be be solvent to whatever data integrity rules you may have for that type of transaction, right? Loan transaction, all that data sits around for 30 years. If you had 30-year mortgage, right? So
Right.
having all that data set, but the analyst who doesn't necessarily need to engage with any active content, they just need to review that content, whether it
Right.
be
They just need to look at the known good data so that they can continue along with whatever
correct.
analysis or thing they're creating.
Yeah. So you actually keep that chain of custody
Right.
throughout the cycle of this process. And that's one of those major concerns. It's like, hey, we want to make sure we're looking at the original, but at the same time, you open yourself up to a certain degree of risk. And the accepted risk has been, hey, we scan that file for malware. We have an endpoint tool.
Right.
Therefore, we're going to take our chances with that because it's we
It's a big
trust those
chance though,
tools.
right? Because all it takes is the one. And
Yeah.
this really does speak to the stuff that is not detectable. Right.
Yeah.
So CDR doesn't, it doesn't really rely on detection as much as it is sanitization and pulling out just the good parts,
Yeah.
recreating a new file so that the, work productivity can continue. And then, we'll keep the original, in quarantine somewhere.
Yeah, and the unseen benefit of this is when you actually plug those things in and you incorporate this into your SOAR platform and working within the scope of your SOC, right?
Right.
Analyst has, or the loan officer, whomever's reviewing that data set, has those sanitized copies, and they're able to actually process whatever transaction needs to physically take place. If there was a detection, there
Mhm.
was something detected as malicious or suspicious from a script or macro or whatever it may be from a file injection standpoint, uh, that trigger, goes to that SOC analyst who's now able to actually go recover the original file in a safe and secure manner and move it to an area that's actually secured and designed around handling malware. So
Right.
you now have another mechanism to make sure that, hey, the data integrity is still there. We're just taking a copy to do that analysis, and we still have the original here. So it actually helps facilitate a lot of your normal actions and activities while still allowing the speed of business to happen in a manner that's appropriate for that specific activity.
Right. No, great points. We'll jump to the next story. Uh, so this is another, of course, another financial institution, and we'll talk a little bit about how they've integrated Sandbox as well as the multi-scanning. They're like a lot of banks, lots of regulatory pressure, right? There's a lot of visibility with PCI, ISO, the various, other governmental regulations that exist for banks. And what they had was, quite a few breaches from files that made it through the perimeter, and they just did not have the manpower, right, the resources and some of the tools in order to track those down and and actually secure the environment.
So, Adam, what's the main enemy of using a sandbox in a customer environment?
Probably time,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Like,
Eh,
yeah, I mean, one of the myths that we talk about, not we didn't include it here, but we have seen it in some customer RFPs where they they're under the impression that they just need to sandbox everything,
Yeah,
and I like that from a from some perspective, but in practicality, am I right? Am I on the right track?
yeah, right. And that's exactly it, right? Time. Sandbox is time. Right? It's the time to actually run those things. Whether you're actually scraping that down to bare metal, you're using some type of virtual machine to detonate. Well, savvy malware writers, right, have built those types of detections into their toolkit. Right?
Right.
They're looking at various types of detonation. What is the network path to the internet? Right? What am I actually running on? Is there a hypervisor present? Right? Or common things installed inside of my environment before I physically launch this? Would I be launching in a Windows desktop that doesn't have some form of word processing tool, whether it be a bookmark to Google, to Google Docs, or Microsoft Office installed locally on that device to actually activate? So they look for a lot of those types of things, and
Yeah.
all of those things take time, but they don't always trigger. right? And we do a great job after it gets to the endpoint of detecting behavior now,
Sure.
right? Our next gen antivirus solutions are phenomenal at actually detecting malicious behavior types and behaviors. And we've built out a set of rules, Yara rules or IOCs that we've pumped into our SIMs and our SOAR platforms and every place else to detect some of those behaviors so that we can actually rapidly respond. But at
Yeah.
that point, something is impacted or infected. So by by taking that multiple animal antivirus approach, right, we can minimize the number of things that we do have to sandbox.
Right. Well,
So
you get rid of the white noise, right? So
yeah,
you do the easy thing for the easy things, which is multiple AV engines. That gives you some, I'll talk about it a little bit more
yeah,
here in a minute, but you get that regional specialty, you get, a global coverage with, multiple eyes across the globe in order to be able to detect it faster
yeah.
than you would with just one.
Absolutely. And one of the innovations from OPSWAT is our emulation-based sandbox.
Yeah.
So what if you could actually, as you take that file apart, remember we do this for CDR, we do this for software bill of materials, trying to understand there's a vulnerability in that code as you
Mhm.
launch it. But what if you can actually look at that code and what the execution is for each component of that specific file that actually is moving throughout the scope of your environment, inbound, outbound, inside, and then look at those behaviors and then build IOCs off of those behaviors in an automated fashion based on the platform that you have. Whether
Right.
it be picking those things off in Splunk and looking for IOCs that maybe exist or file hashes or URLs that actually are incorporated within the scope of that emulation. But the reality of that is we can do that much faster than if we're actually trying to run that file. And then we have to set time acceleration timers to say,
Right.
hey, it's going to be dormant. It's going to wait for 5 minutes because that's the timeout, the default timeout value for most sandboxes. So what if you can do that, right? Comes in through your email. What if you use that emulation-based sandbox, deliver that? And oh, by the way, if it's risky, what if we CDR it after that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have that layered protection type, but we're picking off so many of those initial threats that the number of files that needs to be sandboxed is minimized.
Right.
But the enriched data that you get from an emulation-based sandbox, where they're looking at the execution of code at each layer, allows you to more effectively streamline your not just your triage process, but your ability to identify other behaviors and or risks as they enter your or exit your environment.
Yeah. That's great.
Oh, and they mentioned air gapped environments, and that's something
Oh,
else
yeah.
that comes across. Uh, a lot of cases we hear about that, and DoD type spaces. We hear about a lot nuclear facilities, again, water,
Mhm.
power, gas, where you have these air gapped environments with machinery running. In some cases, automotive and manufacturing uses air gapped environments. Well, we know that a lot of financial organizations have started to air gap a lot of their IoT based environments based off of some of the risks provided by those third parties, right? Remember, hey, what if I need to go each
Right.
device and try to update all my thermostats across 22 different properties, right? 10 different brands, 15 different models, whatever that may be. Well, a lot of cases we're air gapping those environments. Well, what if you can actually have a manner and a method to actually safely and securely move that from one place to the other, right?
Right.
IT to OT, you're doing that through a managed transfer service with authenticated devices on the other end and the ability to emulate all of that software as it goes in between those two places to make sure what you're putting in that critical OT environment is not compromised. And
Right.
the intent of each individual piece of code that's actually going into that environment. And that creates a strength across a detection that you just typically don't have with 99.9% of the solutions out there. Now, you could put
Right.
together, sure, you could piece together some things here and there and
And
take a subset of tools and put this together and make it go. But if you can do it all through one platform with the common reporting, common verbiage, and a high degree of efficacy, you can save yourself a lot of time, effort, money, and resources.
yeah. Speaking of people wanting to save money and time, so the cloud, right? We'll talk about, the cloud in
Yeah.
general. The AWS is obviously the big dog out there. This can apply to anyone though, right? Whether you're on GCP, Azure, Alibaba, they're as we have moved to the cloud, right? As companies have moved their services, again, it opens up that attack area because this speaks directly to one of the things that AWS helped popularize, which is the shared responsibility model.
Yeah.
Because they're setting up this this hosting service, and they've got security tools, but they had to remind their users that this is what AWS does, and this is what you, the customer, are responsible to do. And so this is kind of where we start partnering with customers to help them fulfill their part of that shared responsibility model.
Yeah. And there's a proliferation data, right? It's easy, right? Setting up a new S3 bucket is easy.
Right.
Usually we put lots of controls in place. A lot of my financial services customers don't allow access to the console, so everything has to be done via code, and that helps minimize some of that risk. But we're spinning those things up and down in dev environments all day, and in many cases, many of those dev environments go left alone for the project gets canceled. Right? We're not going to do that anymore, and that data still sits there. So you need to be able to discover those things where that data may be. And if that data does go in transit, maybe you need to make sure there's no PII leaving the environment. Maybe you just want to be alerted that that file is actually going from place to place or being accessed. So having all of that context, but more importantly, as that data goes in motion, being able to understand that this file is clean. So if they are picking something off or somebody's putting something in there, hoping to maybe dupe somebody into doing something in an old
Right.
bucket someplace, that generates alerts, and somebody wants to go look to see what was there, and they click on it and like, boop, gotcha, right? You need to be able to scan those things effectively, but you need to do so in a fashion that's automated, because if you try to track down every single one of those resources
Oh,
with the number of accounts that you have across most of these financial services companies, it'd be extraordinarily difficult, especially with IAM permissions being so pervasive. You may not get all the access you need to do the inspection you need, and that becomes a
sure.
challenge all unto itself. And this is having an ability to actually look at those things dynamically in real time as files enter or exit that environment is critical.
So how do we help them? A couple of things I know. When we talk about AWS, again, it doesn't matter if it's AWS, Azure, GCP, or a combination, because the truth is most people have, right? I don't know of very many companies that say I'm only going to host here and I'm never going to use anything anywhere else, right?
Yeah,
Which kind of
it,
doubles and triples the issue with now you've got IAM that you have to sort out here and over at the new service.
yeah. We're moving to GCP, but we still use Microsoft SharePoint. So we're
Right.
not using Azure, but you are using SharePoint, right? So it is still a data storage platform that exists someplace else. Maybe using a data transport provider, an managed file transfer service like Box, to actually facilitate communication between your clientele and your organization or business unit. Those are still file transport mechanisms that need to actually be monitored and scanned for content.
Right.
So while you may only be limiting yourself down to one cloud, odds are you're probably using another SaaS platform, whether it be Workday, Salesforce, right,
Right.
with all that content that sits
Right. With
someplace
all
else
the
that's being
crown
accessed.
jewels of the
Yeah,
company in
and
Salesforce, and it's all, yeah, it's all
well, and
fine.
the advantage of something like a private link, right, allows you to connect directly to that specific share over a dedicated VPC-based connection, which puts another set of guardrails that prevents external access,
Sure.
right? But it still doesn't guard you from the
Malicious
content that may
acts.
be in that data as it comes back and forth, or even enters that environment from that third-party app.
Right.
And that resource management is almost never centralized, but the ability to scan it may be, right? So that as new buckets come up, what if you could automatically detect that there's a new bucket, right? And having, partnering with our customers to make sure that the IAM permissions are there just to read and detect that there's a new bucket spinning up, and then automatically be able to actually go in and look at those files as
Right.
they're placed in that folder. And that is so difficult to do. Again, talk about the proliferation of QA and application dev teams that are constantly building and tearing down and building and tearing down to try and find the most efficient way to actually deliver that application for their business. And so a lot of those things are dynamic in nature, and they're certainly not visible 100% of the time by the folks that are usually doing that monitoring. So If we can actually do that for our customers, we can help eliminate or reduce a great degree of risk when it comes to files moving in and out of those resources.
Absolutely. So how do we do it? Right. We've talked about some customer stories. We've talked about some of the issues that people experience with file security. So we're going to jump into the OPSWAT technologies that we've been kind of, like I said, kind of hinting toward. Um, so this right here is a good view of the MetaDefender platform, right? So it's a collection of several different key technologies and then some supporting technologies that really help us take a full comprehensive look at files, through a lens that isn't necessarily delivered by other companies out there. The first one is Metascan. We'll talk about that, but there's also the CDR, the sandbox. We've got DLP, and a bunch of other ways to analyze files, beyond just your typical single AV. And and we'll look at it more at the end of where some of these components fit in, to help kind of put out that ball of fire that we talked about.
And the key is and the key here is platform, right?
Right.
It's a platform. And the beauty of the OPSWAT Meta Defender platform is it can be delivered in in a way that suits that each individual environment, right? It could be a combination of a SaaS, cloud-based SaaS application that's delivered.
Mhm.
It could be installed within a Kubernetes framework. It could be installed on bare metal inside of your data center. We can install and a combination thereof, right? Managed from a central place with a common set of policies and workflows, which workflow piece is definitely what makes us unique.
Yeah.
We can absolutely answer any questions about what workflow means inside the Meta Defender platform, but it's the ability to consume it in a manner that's effective for your environment, right? And in many of these financial organizations, they have a multitude environments, right? I keep using that word multitude, but because that's exactly what it is. Many environments inside the scope of a single organization that don't necessarily always use the same infrastructure to deliver
Right.
content or business. And as a result, you need to do things a little bit differently there. Yes, can you get a lot of those things to common API server and get that data to your service provider? Absolutely. But some cases it needs to be installed there, especially in air gapped environments. And so if you can't do that via code, you can't install that in some way, shape, or form that's secure. You can't necessarily deliver effective controls inside the scope of that environment. And you kind of got to wing it and hope that
Yeah.
everything that goes from the outside to the in is secure in some way, shape, or form. So that variance and variability in how we can actually deliver the Meta Defender platform for our customers is definitely a distinguishing factor that's helped every financial services company that we've been engaged with do business at the speed in which they need to do business.
Yeah. Good point. So here's another look, right, at the technologies. Essentially, Metascan is our multi-scanning technology. Um, we use a combination of 30 different, or 30 plus commercial AV engines, to scan concurrently, right? To scan in parallel, 10 files a second basically is, that's kind of how we start the sizing exercise. But, what this does is combine that visibility for the known malware with these other technologies. And actually, let me go to the next slide where we can talk a little bit more about multi-scanning. So here's all the different vendors that we work with. We actually OEM these SDKs, and using a combination of these engines, we can deliver almost 100% detection coverage. Right there's never going to be 100% detection. um, where we sit in the network is with that data in motion, right? So we are using uh, a technology that wasn't necessarily designed to sit at the perimeter, right? And desktop AV does have some advantages of being on a desktop because they have access to memory, they have access to maybe some sort of EDR. But the thing is, again, like we talked about earlier, it relies on that one desktop security vendor to be doing good every day of the week and not just have a bad Monday. And you've already let the malware into the organization to where it can spread. And what we're able to do is take multiple engines and combine those, combine that global visibility, combine the regionalized specialty of these different vendors to give you, as the before the malicious file actually gets into your network, we're able to scan it and detect it right there at the perimeter.
Yeah, and it's the ability to do it in parallel, right? So
Right.
you're not doing this in series. I've worked with a number of financial services organizations that built out something similar for themselves, and typically they move it from one box to the next to actually perform this specific scanning, or they built some form of logic that looks for a conviction and then moves on to the next. We do this all in parallel. You mentioned the 10 files a second. That's kind of our baseline, but hey, guess what? We can cluster. So if you have
Right.
larger architecture,
Per
again,
instance. Yeah, I should have said per instance.
yeah, and so we can absolutely cluster those things as well. So, and we
Right.
do have customers that will throw 1,000 files at us, simultaneously, and we scale those clusters effectively, right? Hopefully they're not throwing 1,000 files at us every second for the entire day, but there are bursts where those things do happen. Maybe they have a end of year process or end of quarter process where they actually throw all those files through the system. We're able to actually scale and handle those things accordingly. Wouldn't want to actually have to do all that. It'd get expensive, but
Sure.
it's one of those things where, hey, if it's needed, we have the capacity to actually handle it, even if it's on an ad hoc basis. We have architectures we can design for our customers. They can actually overcome those things, even if you only need to spin them up. I mentioned Kubernetes, right? The beauty of Kubernetes being able to actually spin up containers to handle those loads in a distributed fashion when needed, right? So when you're throwing those 100 files at it simultaneously, hey, we can go handle that, and we can do it in a manner that's actually effective for you to actually handle your business. And then we can add those layers in that you're about to get to.
Yeah. Well, the one thing on here that I want to make sure people have clear is that we're not suggesting that you don't have desktop AV. We're not suggesting to get rid of anything, right? That really the idea is you've got your defense in depth, right? Desktop AV, that should be your last line of defense, right?
It is the end point.
Right. It is the end point. And we use some great engines that provide great desktop AV coverage, EDR solutions, ML based engines, heuristics, and all of that. The key is being able to eliminate that white noise at the perimeter, right? Be able to use the technologies that we have to stop it before it gets into the network, so that you have more time, to take care of the other issues, right? If we can reduce that white noise and reduce that attack surface at the perimeter, that's what we want to do. Don't get rid of your desktop AV, but don't rely just on your desktop AV.
Yeah, and as a side note, we actually have our Meta Defender IT Access, which actually has an agent that can actually sit on those endpoints as well. They can submit those files as they enter your endpoint. So for those clandestine devices that maybe operate outside the scope of all your other controls, and you still want to throw them through Meta Defender and our multi-scanning engine, we can do that as well. So again, a way to cover every customer, no matter where they sit and how they sit.
Deep CDR is one of the other main technologies. This when I first joined OPSWAT, I was not aware of CDR, and it blew my mind how much coverage you can get for so little. Right? It's detectionless. Doesn't have to know about this new malware, this new 0-day, this new script that AI produced. It simply goes through the file, finds anything that may potentially contain active code, right? There's a lot of different places where, take for example a Word doc. Back in the day, it used to be a file, right? It would be a flat file, and it has some some markup and stuff in there to do bold and all of that, but it was a file. Along comes OLE, and now you can take this file and embed it inside of another file. Inside that file, you can embed another file, and then somewhere deep down in there, you've got a malicious script. That's something that no AV can do, right? No AV is going to be able to do that unpacking to get down to where that script is because it's so heavily embedded. That's really where CDR comes in. And I think is, Garrett, you talked about it earlier, being able to sanitize the stuff as it comes through so that people can continue work, right? That workflow is maintained, but then we're only sending along the known good parts of the file, just the text parts that can't possibly contain anything active. And, it really speaks to maintaining business productivity while also applying a very high level of security to the files as they come in.
Yeah, and most financial services companies are using some form of this protection, where they're actually isolating documents, right? Whether you talk
Mhm.
about safe links or you talk about document isolation as it comes in through an email or a mechanism that comes through something that can be intercepted, right? And that's a great method of doing this, but that only covers a couple of vectors, right? And by the way, when you get the chain of custody, you may still have to handle the original. And
Right.
so somebody's going to have to go look at it. And CDR allows us the best of both worlds. We can detect that behavior, report on it, and then you can go investigate, what is this file? Detonate it in the emulation-based sandbox, understand what the intent of that code that was ripped out of that file was actually trying to do. Oh, it was trying to go to a website and download another piece of code and download another piece of code.
Right.
So it's a great way to layer your protections in, but to give the people that need access to those files immediately access to those files in a safe, secure manner with zero risk to the endpoint. And we do mean literally zero risk to the endpoint.
Right.
We've taken out every piece of active content. We've re-rendered images. We've taken all of that. We've deconstructed all of those components, and we're delivering that sanitized, benign copy to the physical end user.
Yep. Next thing we have SBOM. Garrett, I'm gonna leave that too because I know you've had some great comments in our conversations in the past.
Yeah.
I know you've talked with customers about it, so take it.
Yeah, it's one of those things. So how do you know that when you're deploying updates within the scope of your environment or deploying a new tool that you're not actually introducing additional vulnerabilities into your environment? We all use them. You all use multiple scanners typically when we're deploying software within the scope of our environment, whether it's vulnerability scans, whether it's software code execution scans. We're all doing this on a regular basis to make sure the integrity of the code we deliver to our endpoints is of a high degree of quality,
Right.
but also doesn't introduce any additional risk into the environment. However, those risks still it may exist, whether you know about them or not. So the ability to decompile uh, those binary files, right? Look at those container images and understand what you're introducing into the environment
Right.
ahead of deployment is extremely critical as part of your workflow. So if you're going to deploy a new tool to actually enhance productivity across your business unit, you want to make sure that you're not introducing some type of vulnerability that could be exploited either intentionally or accidentally. And we've seen
Right.
that in code, right? We saw that in banking code that was delivered where someone had compromised the certificate, amended code, and that was delivered into the scope of an environment. And then a breach obviously took place, and customer
Sure.
data was stolen. Now it would be data was stolen and encrypted, or maybe they tossed your bucket keys. So
Right.
those things do happen, and the idea here is that we can identify most of those things. I wouldn't say 100%, but that 99.9% we can identify that risk before you deploy it into your environment and eliminate all of it altogether. By the
Right.
way, you can still run all these things through the adaptive sandbox at the same time to figure out
Right.
if that code execute. When you look at that installer, here's all the scripts that are actually interacting with the operating system, and here's all the things they're doing. These are normal behaviors. These are suspicious behaviors. These are
Right.
benign behaviors. This is critical.
Yeah.
So you still get that scope and context. And again, it's by using a platform that layers all these capabilities in.
It can
But
plug all the different things in, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but doing it from a single pane of glass, right?
Right.
And giving all of that analytics and all that intelligence to the folks that can actually do something with it. But in the case of SBOM, hey, let's not introduce new vulnerabilities into our environment. Let's validate that the code that we're deploying inside of any environment is free of any known vulnerability and minimize and mitigate that risk before it ever takes a foothold in your environment.
Got it. Yeah, that, and the next step to that, right, is, what you mentioned, sandbox. And, there's a gap that we haven't really talked about, right, which is URLs, right? We
Yeah.
can do a safe URL redirect with CDR. You can identify if a URL is in the file, but the one thing that even, 30 different AV engines altogether and CDR can't do is tell you what is that URL, right? It's the one big gap in that type of technology that we can cover here with Sandbox, and do it in a way that is beneficial to the business. If you have to run every suspicious file through a VM based sandbox, number one, how long do you have, right? Do you have 10 minutes? Do you have 15 minutes per file, right? And that's how many different VMs. It's a lot of hardware. Um, and again, they've got evasion built in so that they can tell if it's running in a sandbox. And that's really where the benefit of an emulation based sandbox comes in, is we're able to look at all of those commands, look at the URLs, look at all the content to actually determine really quickly, right, without having to do a lot of waiting. Our I would say the amount of time, we say 10 times faster than a traditional sandbox. We're scanning, we're generally finishing each assessment of these files, depending on the file type, but in about 10 seconds,
Yeah.
right? Which is a whole lot faster than most people have in their mind about the ability to do sandboxing on all the files.
Yeah, and within that scope, you can apply your own YAR rules. So that collection of data you built up over time that's maybe targeted financial services that's not shared with the world, you
Right.
can apply that to that sandbox to actually add additional checks within the scope of that specific execution. But the most important part to me specifically is looking at that, the IOC extraction component, right? The ability to take all of those pieces out and in an automated fashion be able to apply those things to the platforms in your environment that are going to allow you to detect those behaviors outside of your endpoint or your file scanning delivery tools, right? So when we get those URLs, and DNS poisoning is a real thing, right? So maybe it is a legit URL, but the DNS cache that you're connecting to for that specific asset is poisoned, and so
Yeah.
it's sending you someplace else. So the URL comes across your proxy as being legitimate, right? And then but it's directing you on the back end someplace else, and in some cases they'll to get you 2, 3, 4, 5 redirects, right, before it
Yeah.
actually pulls a specific file down, and that's how they can detect what's sitting in front of them, so that they can design a better attack to actually get malicious code through your system. So it's just another way that we can actually say, hey, by the way, we see files where it's actually going to get here. Create an
Mhm.
IOC that detects any traffic that's going here,
Yeah.
legitimate or not. And by the way, we're stringing those things together because our adaptive sandbox is going to start to look at in the next release URL after URL, right? We're pulling those things down as we go. So you're able to get deeper into that IOC extraction and really protect yourself against some really big, nasty evasion
and
techniques.
and be able to turn out the IOCs quickly, right?
Yeah,
That's the shorter window that you can have for attackers. That's brilliant. Okay,
absolutely.
we'll cover a couple of other technologies here that we haven't really talked about, but it goes back to the idea, and I'll show you a thing at the end. We're getting close to the end now. That really ties everything together as far as a platform, right? We're not necessarily a DLP first vendor, but we have some great DLP that is available through the platform, right? So one of the things that we kind of pride ourselves on for our DLP is, again, maintaining the data in motion and being able to not just detect a potential policy violation, right? Because that's what we're talking about in general is compliance and policy, but not just detect it, but be able to do redaction. right? So in documents, whether it's in pictures, taking all of these things that we can detect, put those into the policy, and then as the file is moving through, we can watermark it even, right? So that we're not necessarily stopping the work from happening, but we are preventing compliance violations by redacting that PII or PHI as it's moving through.
Yeah, and one of the common things I'm seeing from a use case perspective as data goes in transit is people are ingesting things like statements, and old help desk documents and things of that nature. How about we redact all of that PII, or identifiable information from that document as it gets into your LLM, right?
Right.
As you build your AI capacities out to make sure that something doesn't accidentally leak in there, right? So it's a great tool to actually use, but again, it's part of a platform that allows you to identify a workflow that's suitable for that specific approach.
Yeah.
And again, anywhere data is moving inside the scope of your environment, outside in, inside out, being able to actually apply this holistically as a globalized policy and just allow you to maintain that compliance, reduce that risk dramatically in a single platform before it gets to the end point.
Right. Last thing that we'll talk about, threat intelligence. We did acquire some threat intelligence technology that we have integrated into the MetaDefender platform now. And really, if we were to go through this presentation backwards, it would kind of tell a story about how we get the threat detection, right? We take external threat detection, we're generating it with Sandbox so that you can take those IOCs, add them into your threat detection pipeline, whether you're using ours or a combination of RTI and another tool, being able to take all of that information and put it together so that you can, whether you're in your SIM or your SOAR or another custom tool, take all the detections, the alerts, the reports from CDR, and the outcome, the extracted IOCs from Sandbox, and use that with our existing threat intelligence technology, third party, to give you that broad visibility into what needs to be detected out there.
And applying that again, data in motion, regardless of how it's transgressing through an environment, right? And we have the air gap component in there as well, so the ability to actually apply that to air gapped environments for files that are actually entering those environments. So super important to be able to understand what's happening there. It is another threat intelligence component, but it's built into a platform that's going to inspect every single piece of data that's coming in and out of your environment in a file format.
And so we get to the end. This is the big slide, right? This is the we have the ball of fire slide that talks about all the different ways that data can move through. This kind of draws it into where does OPSWAT sit in in a customer organization. We have a lot of different integrations, right? Whether you're talking about storage providers, like Box or any of the CSPs, whether you're talking about WAF and load balancer, reverse proxy integrations, files moving through those to a banking customer portal, right? If you've got an F5 or any one of those in there, we can integrate with that device and scan the file for you, and then hand the response back so that the file can move through. MFT, we've got a solution that will securely manage the files as they're moving from low to high, as they're moving from department to department, and your traditional on-premise storage. And we can deliver all the technologies that we've been talking about are managed through that one central platform, right? So no matter if you've got data here, there, a combination of everywhere, we do have the deployment flexibility and the capability to install in whatever environment you are, right? Like one of the things that I always try to say is that we will meet the customer where their data is, right? We have a solution no matter where those files are that we can plug in. And if we don't have a native integration, we have a fully documented REST API that will give them all of that capability as well.
Right? With the security mindset, which is also very, very important. File security first, understanding that we're going to trust no file as it enters or exits or transits within the scope of your environment. So the ability to connect where you are, the ability to design an infrastructure based off of your business needs and your infrastructure requirements, in a manner that actually, I like to say we're the Switzerland of scanning, right? We connect to anything. We're friendly with everything,
Yeah.
and we have a way to make sure that people feel protected, and we do it with incredible technology and an incredible set of partners that allow us to execute on a daily basis. It makes it really easy to help me protect our national interests as well as our financial services organizations across the globe.
Yeah. Well, Garrett, I think we're done. I want to say thank you for your time, and thank you to those that joined. If you'd like to learn more about OPSWAT, um, get a copy of that QR code with your mobile device, and we've got resources out there. We'd love to connect with you and help figure out how we can solve your file security needs.
Thank you very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. Had a lot of fun. Look forward to the next one.
All right, folks. Take care.